Hello. I'm not sure if this week was advertised or not. I've been scattered. I've been live for 15 seconds already, which means dead air. Anyway, I don't know how advertised this was, but what I do know is that I started teaching classes this week, so I was a little distracted, so forgive me. Hi, Lynn. So there is someone here, one of you, uh, and I also know that I'm covering topics that are a topic that might be difficult to deal with today, difficult to deal with at any time, really. Hi, Jay. But worth understanding and seeing and knowing, which is the operation of the transatlantic slave trade. Hi, Cassandra. Uh, so, just so you know, I'm not scattered generally for today's material. I am scattered in terms of I'm currently teaching 4 courses, college courses. So my brain is in a few different places at once. So I wanted to say hello, and I will be covering this material as always. I'll be providing links afterwards to provide more information and greater understanding, and I'll share that. Hi, Nicole. Oh, so you are here. I haven't been quite as attentive on Facebook, so I was not sure if it got spread around or not. I know that if the semester is starting, that means my collaborator Lauren has also started working on various things, so she's also busy. That said, I will definitely be continuing to do these each week as long as I have topics. Lauren posted a survey about topics you want covered, so please feel free to suggest some. I can't necessarily cover everything you might suggest because, of course, I'm not well versed in every topic imaginable, but I will try to do my best to do as much as I possibly can that I feel comfortable and confident in my own knowledge to share productively with you all. So I think it's worth starting now, the content of today. And as always, I will begin with my standard boilerplate, so forgive me, but remember there might be people seeing this the first time, and it is always important to know that when presented with information, one should always consider the source, consider the materials, consider the research. And what I mean is we are awash in today's society in misinformation and lies, and we have to learn to sift through all of the misinformation to find the nuggets of truth. That said, I am someone who's going to provide you with information, so let me explain to you this source and who I am and whether and what qualifies me, if you will, to discuss this. So, again, my name is Joseph Solar. I hold a PhD in urban education from Temple University, and I teach African American history at Rowan College of Burlington County, RCBC. And I also teach political science and history and literature at Alvernia University. That's my current adjunct job. I did my dissertation on educational policy, and I engaged specifically and deliberately with issues of educational policy and race. And my undergraduate training, my undergraduate education is from Harvard University. I studied history and African American studies there with those luminaries like Henry Louis Gates Jr. and Cornel West and Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, Randy Mattori, just a list of incredibly brilliant people who shared their knowledge and their wisdom with me. And I hope that I honor their teaching by spreading what they taught me to others. So, that said, today I'm going to cover the transatlantic slave trade and how it operated, what it was like. Some of what I will talk about today is distressing because the transatlantic slave trade was distressing. it might send off feelings of emotions, sadness, negativity, anger, any number of things. I am aware of this. Some of the material I cover today, I know from observing my students in class when I've covered this in class, it has brought some of my students to tears of sadness because of the realities which people had to endure. What I said in my description and what I mean today is when we look at some of the horrors of the slave trade, and not everything's going to be about the horrors of the slave trade. Hi, Lucy. Some of it is just about things. But when we discuss some of the horrors of the slave trade, understand that it's not meant to come from a place of voyeurism, kind of the way like people love to watch horror. But when we see the horrors that people endured and those who are descended from the survivors of those horrors, we have to recognize that those individuals who survived this were incredibly resilient, incredibly strong, incredibly tough. And as we face challenges and difficulties of today, Martin Luther King Jr. is ringing in my head at the moment, we have to recognize that for those of you who have enslaved ancestors, you can endure today because they endured yesterday. And that's why I want to talk about this today. So, to get into transatlantic slave trade, I will provide sources at the end. Absolutely, you know I got you covered. And one of the resources I will provide to you today is an international database called Slave Voyages. And it's an incredible resource that attempts to document every single transatlantic, and some that stayed within Africa, and some that went east from Africa, slave voyage. So I'll send you this link and you can just dig in and just get lost for hours. But again, so the transatlantic slave trade, as many people point out, including apologists for today's racism, slavery is fundamental to the American experience, to the world experience. Slavery has always existed, where one group of people is able to dominate and force other people to do the work. They have always been willing to do so. There is even today something quite akin to slavery that continues to exist. All of that in no way, despite what people say, excuses police brutality or excuses systemic discrimination. But I'm going to focus on the transatlantic slave trade and African slave trade. So, slavery has always existed, and one of the earliest forms of African slavery emerges in the Roman era, where the Romans pretty much enslaved everybody they could, whether they be Europeans, Africans, or Asians. Over time, when the Western Roman Empire collapses and the Islamic world emerges to take its place in North Africa and southwestern Europe, we see the emergence of a trans-Saharan slave trade. And so, just like Christians, Muslims were forbidden from enslaving fellow religious. So, Christians were not allowed to enslave fellow Christians. Christians were allowed to enslave Muslims. Christians were allowed to enslave Jews. Christians were allowed to enslave pretty much anybody who wasn't a Christian. Islam is a little more prohibitive because in traditional Islam, they acknowledge people of the book, people in error. In other words, people who, from the Islamic perspective, acknowledge Allah as the one God, but whose practice of the religion was considered incorrect. So that means that Muslims, theoretically, were not allowed to enslave not just fellow Muslims, but they were also not allowed to enslave Christians, and were not allowed to enslave Jews, and not allowed to enslave Zoroastrians. So what that meant in the Islamic world is that Muslims had to seek pagans to enslave. And to the north of them were Christians, to the east of them were Zoroastrians in Iran, and only across the Sahara Desert were there, quote, pagans that they could enslave, and so they began a trans-Saharan slave trade across to sub-Saharan Africa, bringing Africans who were not Muslim, Christians, or Jews north, into North Africa and into Europe. So fast forward hundreds of years to something I discussed a few weeks ago, the Portuguese explorations down the African coast. The Portuguese are exploring the African coast to get past Islam, basically. They don't like that the Silk Road and the trade routes to China are controlled by Muslims, and so they're trying to circle Africa and bypass them. The reason why the Portuguese land in Congo is it's the first large major kingdom where they land where the king was not Muslim. And in fact, one of their first things they begin working on is to convert the king of Congo to Catholicism, and I covered this, how the kingdoms of Congo and then eventually Ndango become Catholic kingdoms in West Central Africa. And the Portuguese begin trading with these kingdoms for goods, and the Congolese, as an expansionist empire themselves, were engaged in their own domestic slave trade of non-Congolese, and they begin trading enslaved Africans to the Portuguese. And the Portuguese bring these enslaved Africans back with them to Portugal. And I remember week 1 or week 2 posting this painting of Lisbon in the 1670s that shows just how Africanized the Kingdom of Portugal had become, because the Portuguese, as a kind of cut off at the edge of Europe, small population country, needed population, and so they're bringing in Congolese Africans by the thousands. After the discovery of the, quote, New World, meaning the world that Europeans had never heard of, and Africans, we see the Portuguese get a slice of the action in terms of Brazil. The Portuguese begin exploring the Brazilian coastline by the early 1500s and begin settling there. The Spanish begin settling in the Caribbean and then eventually into Mexico. As we discussed, at this time, the Spanish have enslaved Africans as well, and some of these enslaved Africans become free. Some of these enslaved Africans, as enslaved people, are part of the journeys of exploration throughout the Caribbean, throughout the southeastern and southwestern United States, into South America, and so there's an African presence in the Western Hemisphere from the very beginning of the European colonization, and so really it is more accurate to say that it was a European and African colonization. The Spanish and the Portuguese immediately began enslaving native populations that were not Christian. And as you may or may not know, between 1500 and 1600, the native population of the Americas, North, Central, and South America, and the Caribbean, is utterly devastated by European disease, Spanish and Portuguese brutality, and enslavement. What happens in those 100 years is about 90% of the, quote, pre-Columbian population of the Americas dies. What does this mean? What this means is that the Spanish were killing off and losing to smallpox, typhus, yellow fever, malaria, was losing the population of human beings that they had been enslaving. And so little by little, the Spanish begin to purchase enslaved Africans to add to the workforce in the Americas. The Barranquilla Peninsula in Colombia becomes it becomes a major slave trading port in the Caribbean, where enslaved Africans are brought into Colombia and then from there are dispersed into South America. There are enslaved Africans working in the gold mines in Mexico. Eventually, they'll be working in the silver mines in Peru. And so enslaved Africans are brought over to replace the native population that was dying off. And so at the time, the Spanish and Portuguese are conducting the trade as part of their general trade. And what I mean by this is the Spanish and the Spanish in particular, the Portuguese a little later on. The Spanish are primarily concerned with extracting wealth out of the New World. They're hungry for gold, they're hungry for silver, they're just trying to basically plunder all those riches, the mineral wealth, and bring it back to Europe. Eventually, the gold and silver supplies will begin to run out. And when I say eventually, what I mean is this is a very slow and gradual process. Between 1500 and 1600, 100 years, we are talking millions of people are dying of diseases. Thousands of Africans are brought to the New World. Many of them become free. Many of them will die enslaved to the Spanish and Portuguese. Many of them become Catholics. And so little by little, it's just people being brought over on Spanish and Portuguese trading ships that, of course, are trading ships. And this is what I mean about the kind of how does it slowly begin. The Portuguese dominate the slave trade in the 1500s, and the Spanish eventually will annex Portugal and make Portugal part of the Kingdom of Spain for some 60 years. And so then the Spanish will dominate the slave trade. And what the Portuguese did is they negotiated with the King of Congo for a cession of land. In other words, the Portuguese are given land in Congo to create a trade colony. Now, this is a very common occurrence. In the city of Barcelona, for example, that's where Columbus is born, likely, because the Barcelona government gave a plot of land to the Genoese, to Italians, to create a trade colony. So, standard procedure, you negotiate with the ruler, you get essentially a little ethnic neighborhood where you can conduct your trade back to your mother country or mother city. So, the Genoese in Barcelona are trading with Genoa, and the city of Luanda, today's city of Luanda, in Angola, is a Portuguese trade city. And so the Portuguese literally set up their lives there, and they trade with Portuguese vessels and Spanish vessels, and they trade for Congolese trade goods, including enslaved people. And so they will build slave pens to hold people as prisoners, as captives, until the slave ships come to carry them away. At this time, when the Spanish and Portuguese are conducting this trade, the ships are designed for carrying basically gold, silver, and other trade goods. And so these are not what comes later, specially designed slave trading vessels. And this is a very key understanding, because a ship that will, say, dock in Cuba, Santiago, or La Habana, if a Spanish trade ship docks there, it'll be a ship that maybe has some swords and gunpowder and some seeds and some animals from Spain and whatever, and a handful of enslaved people as well. So it will just be traded along with all the other trade goods. In other words, slavery is important to the Spanish and the Portuguese, but it's not the only thing. Through the 1500s, enslaved people will be brought over, will suffer hardship, live and die in slavery from overwork, from exhaustion, from malnutrition, from disease. But the crossing would not have been particularly more difficult for enslaved Africans than it was for the sailors. Yes, the enslaved Africans probably would be fed worse than the sailors, and would be locked up in the brig, but they would just be locked up in the brig. It is not until years later, when the trade becomes dominated by the English and Dutch, that things take a more grim turn. So throughout the 1500s, so for 100 years, and again, you really have to keep in mind 100 years is an incredibly long time, Spanish and Portuguese ships will sail down the coast, will trade with Luanda. That said, very early we have records of the King of Congo complaining that some Spanish and Portuguese ships would come into the shoreline, send out raiding parties, and literally just kidnap Africans they find in villages or fishing or whatever, throw them in the jail, throw them in the cells, and bring them over to Cuba or Mexico or Colombia or whatever, and sell them into slavery. The Portuguese begin bringing them into Rio de Janeiro, and etc. So what drives the increase in demand? So working in the mines is deadly work. Even today, when it's paid wage labor, you still have miners who die. So that kills a lot of people, and the people are then brought over to replace them. But as we also know, colonists and settlers died. I mean, most of Jamestown died, and those were free people. So life is horrible for most people, generally speaking. More horrible for enslaved people. The Portuguese find gold in the southern state of what they call gold mine, Minas Gerais, but they begin developing cash crops. And the cash crop is sugar. Sugar is responsible, or the trade for sugar, or the enslavement of people for the sugar trade, is responsible for approximately, these are rough estimates based on historical data, which I'll provide you the link to the source, approximately 80% of Africans who are brought over as captives into slavery in the Americas are brought over to work on sugar plantations throughout the 400 years of the transatlantic slave trade. 80%. That makes America quite different, because America, it's the reverse. It's about 80% of enslaved Africans are not brought over for sugar, because most of our country, or what becomes our country, does not plant sugar. Louisiana has sugar, and Florida will have sugar. So Africans are brought for sugar in the Americas, but not in as great numbers. So through the 1500s, Spain and Portugal are the dominant powers. But by the 1600s, the English, Dutch, and French are rising. They are the rising powers. They are challenging the Spanish and the Portuguese. And the form that this challenge takes at first is literally just piracy. They'll explore the coast, they'll explore the Americas, but really they're just hunting for Spanish ships or Portuguese ships to capture them and to just take everything, just to steal everything as plunder. In fact, the very first 10 Africans brought to Jamestown the birth of English colonial slavery, because it's not American slavery. Again, the birth of American slavery is Florida in the 1560s. But the birth of English slavery in the Americas in 1619 is literally from Dutch pirates who captured a Portuguese ship that had Portuguese goods on board. And some of the Portuguese goods on board this ship included 10 Africans. These 10 Africans are traded to the Jamestown settlers for fresh water and food. And that is how Africans end up in the Jamestown colony, and that's the birth of American slavery through piracy. But that story is indicative of how the trade is evolving and changing. Catholic law, or Roman Catholic traditions, which became part of the Catholic law of Spain and France and Portugal, created opportunities, defined rights for enslaved people that included their freedom. It's the English who invent hereditary slavery. But that was still some 40 years out. As the English and Dutch are rising, they decide that they want greater control over the slave trade. And so in the 1640s, we see conflicts emerge between the Portuguese and the Congolese, the Portuguese and the Ndongolese, and we see the Dutch literally attack Portuguese settlements, and the Dutch seize Brazil, and the Dutch seize Luanda on the African coast. Luanda will be the site of multiple battles between Congolese and Dongolese and Portuguese and Dutch versus each other back and forth, and this is what inspires the English innovation. What the English will do is they will seek offshore islands off the coast of Africa, which are more defensible, and they will build fortresses off the coast, and they will use these fortresses to trade with the mainland of Africa, which will of course maybe just be half a mile away within eyesight. And from these forts they will conduct the trade. By the 1660s and 70s, the English are becoming increasingly dependent, and the Dutch as well, on slave labor. In the case of the Dutch, the Netherlands is another one of these tiny countries with small population, very similar to Portugal. So they are using enslaved labor to be the labor for the colony. The city of New York, which was settled by the Dutch in the 1630s, 1634, I believe, was initially built by the labor of enslaved African men whom the Dutch had purchased as captives from their Congolese trade partners that they had kind of made an alliance with to go against the Portuguese. What that means is these first African men building New York, many of them were Portuguese speakers even. Some of them were Catholic. The Dutch and the English have no scruples about, you don't enslave Christians. They will enslave black people, right? And when we talk about kind of the evolution of the slave trade, we see it's the English and Dutch who begin a transition from religious-based slavery to color-based slavery. But even then, they're just getting into the trade, and just like the Spanish and Portuguese, although the English are beginning to think it out and the Dutch are beginning to think it out, their thoughts on the slave trade are, we need enslaved people to conduct this trade or to as part of our development strategy, our economic strategy, but we don't need hundreds of them, right? For example, the first Africans who were helping build New York was only about 10 people or a dozen people. So we're talking 20, 30 people, handfuls of people that can be put on board ships. But as the English and Dutch slowly begin to take over the trade from the Spanish and Portuguese, they begin to realize that sugar cultivation can be expanded with larger and larger workforces. Just like in the case where the Spanish king managed to become the king of Portugal and unite those two kingdoms at the end of the 1600s. So now we're talking almost 200 years and thousands of Africans over those years, maybe a million. Well, the king of the Netherlands, or the leader of the Netherlands, he becomes king of England. King William of Nassau, William of Nassau becomes the king of England. And so the Dutch Republic and England, or this way in your perspective, become unified as one kingdom. And so now the Dutch, who've been kicked out of Brazil and kicked out of Luanda, are unified, and they are looking under Queen Anne, the daughter of William and Mary, to secure control of the slave trade. Now, the Congolese are Catholics and have a historic relationship with the Portuguese, and so the English have a historic relationship with the Portuguese. So the English begin building slave ports off the coast of what is today Nigeria, Benin, Togo, Sierra Leone, Senegal, basically the forested areas south of Islamic Africa. And they will begin building a network of forts along the coast, which the English will call directly the Slave Coast. It is in the 1700s that the English and Dutch, and increasingly the French, professionalize the slave trade. And what I mean by professionalized is a profession is an area that has standards of practice and behavior, and the English will develop standards and practice of behavior for the transatlantic slave trade. And again, one of the things that you will see on this database of the slave trade voyages is you will see a huge increase in the number of captive Africans sold into slavery. So when we look at the truly just mind-breakingly horrible slave trade, we're talking about the 1700s. Although it is worth noting the slave trade illegally across the Atlantic or legally persists till at least 1863. Maybe even longer in the case of Brazil, but the evidence is a little foggy. So the English professionalized the slave trade. And what does professionalized slave trade mean? What were these standard practices? This is where it gets very grim, but also this is where we can see the courage of people who managed to survive, which is not to say at all that those who didn't survive were not courageous. It's that the slave trade is horrifying. It is utterly horrifying, and normal people forced to endure horrifying things many of us cannot because we're human. So, off the coast of Sierra Leone is the Port Loco Creek. And the English built a slave fortress off the coast, and English people live there year-round, and a large part of this fortress is a containment area, a prison, a giant yard where African middlemen will sail out with their captives and sell them to the British. It is essential and important to understand that even though the Europeans will raid the African coast and kidnap people, the slave trade cannot occur in those vast numbers without African participation, without African kingdoms like Congo, Ouida, Benin, Togo, Dahomey, that are engaged in the slave trade. Because Africans know their own area, Africans have their own enemies, Africans are human beings, which means that Africans are just as flawed and selfish as Europeans can be. And in fact, what's also important to understand is that the Europeans in the 1700s were not strong enough. They didn't have the numbers, they didn't have the technology to conduct the large-scale trade in Africans. So the English would sit at their fort off the coast, and they would wait. And the Temne or the Loco people would bring captives and sell them. These Africans would be separated by sex. The men would be held in one holding pen. Women and children would be held in the other holding pens. And then they would sit. The English would feed them, but not too much, because they want to make a profit. And they would sit in the sun, and they would wait, and they would wait. It is worth noting that at this early stage, while waiting in these slave fortresses, people die. People get diseases, suffer malnutrition. People will end their own lives in despair. And so these slave fortresses are graveyards. A ship would arrive at the fortress, and the English, and they'll be copied by everyone else, but it's almost like a simultaneous. The English and Dutch will begin to build specially designed ships for the slave trade. So, whereas the Spanish and Portuguese had trade ships that included slaves, the English, French, Spanish, and then, of course, Spanish and Portuguese will follow suit eventually, will have ships that are specifically designed for packing in exclusively the greatest number of human beings, controlling them, and delivering them into slavery. There is a video you can see on one of the websites I will provide to you of the only kind of fully planned ship that we have, and it's called the L'Horreur, and it's a French ship. But these ships were thoughtful. And what I mean is professional. They thought, how can we have the most number of people, keep them controlled, keep ourselves safe, and then deliver the greatest number alive into slavery? And so these slave ships would be designed with shackles and shackle anchor points, if you will, screwed into the decks so that enslaved people could be shackled to the decks. Or they'd be designed with small little bunks where people could be stuck in to sleep and shackled into the bunks, etc. So they had different ideas, but basically the idea is the most number of people shackled in and controlled. Many of these slave ships had what they called outer decks, not in the traditional sense, in which the portholes, the holes that led into the decks where the enslaved people would be kept, these decks would be outside so that sailors, if there was a rebellion, because there are many rebellions, could go out these outer decks outside, point their guns into the decks, and shoot and kill the people who were trapped below decks. They built upper decks for enslaved people to go outside once a day, shackled, of course. And so they would be shackled to the decks outside, so maybe they could use the bathroom. They would dump seawater on them as a sort of bath. And of course, these upper decks would also be controlled with guns. In a way to think of it, when you look at, concentration camps, where they had the guard towers and the gun ports and whatnot, these were all designed onto these professional slave trading vessels because they were constantly terrified, right? As the number of enslaved captives increases, the risk increases. When you had a ship with 40 people as a crew and 20 enslaved Africans, a little easier to control. When, as some ships ended up doing, say the Brooks, you had a vessel that could contain upwards of 600 enslaved people, the threat those people posed became real. And so what did it mean? Enslaved people would be sitting, waiting in the fort. If they survived the fort, separated from family members, husbands and wives, fathers from daughters, fathers from sons, parents from kids, they would then be packed onto the slave vessel. Now understand that some of these individuals in these slave forts who are waiting together, they're not the same people. They are different peoples. They might be rival peoples. The English don't care, the Dutch don't care, and so you might have a situation in the case of, say, Sierra Leone, where the Temne and the Loco are at war with each other. And so the Temne might get the upper hand and sell 30 Loco captives into a fort. But then things might shift a month later, and the Loco might sell a dozen Temne. So now these individuals might find themselves thrown into prison, because it was prison, with people they don't like, whose languages they don't understand. And so they begin to accommodate themselves to each other, because at that point they're all in it together. Then they get packed on board the ship. Now, the English and the Dutch designed these ships to try to ensure the maximum number could be delivered into slavery. That doesn't mean the maximum number comfortably delivered into slavery. That doesn't mean the maximum number safely or well-fed delivered into slavery. And so these decks were hot. There was no fresh air. They were awful. Some ships would make no distinguishing between men and women and children, and they'd all be shackled together. Some would separate the men from the women and children and keep them together. And so to be on board one of these ships is to be packed literally as tightly as possible. According to some on the Lahore, they would be enslaved captives would be laid on their side because they would take up less room and packed like this up against each other, in contact with each other, shackled to each other. They would be given a water ration, often not adequate, and sailed across the ocean. So, what does that person experience? Terror, right? These are people who were dragged from their homes, thrown into a fort, thrown onto a large sailing vessel, which maybe they might not have ever seen a vessel this large in their lives, particularly later in the trade as the kingdoms are raiding deeper and deeper into Africa, the parts of Africa that were cut off from the Atlantic and Pacific coasts, and so they don't know the ocean, right? These are the simpler people. They prey upon their simpler, less technologically advanced neighbors, etc. And so it's horrifying. Also, seasickness. All people get seasickness at some point until you get your legs. Many of these Africans would never have had the chance to develop an immunity to seasickness. And so it is very likely that individuals spent the crossing, which could be 2 months, nauseated, sick, terrified. Now, the sailors would let the captives up on the upper decks once a day and rotate them so they could get a little bit of fresh air and use the bathroom. But of course, as you all know, using the bathroom doesn't necessarily follow a regular schedule. And so it is very likely the case that individuals would soil themselves. Maybe they would vomit from seasickness. Maybe they would pee themselves. Maybe they would poop themselves. And so these below decks, which already did not have a good airflow, there would have been a powerful stench of bodily wastes and bodily odors. And of course, ships rock up and down, and so these fluids would have just swished around. So the stench was horrible. And we have accounts from the slave ship captains and slave ship sailors that the stench below decks where the enslaved Africans were kept was utterly horrifying to them. They couldn't stand the smell, that they'd open the deck and just the smell would come out and it was awful, and they thought it was horrible. They couldn't stand it. But mind you, they couldn't stand it, but 300, 400 enslaved Africans were trapped to stand it below decks and would be shackled together. Add into this the fact that these are not kind of soft, polished down shackles. This is raw iron shackles, shackling ankles, shackling wrists, sometimes shackling the neck. And so the rubbing would have literally caused abrasions, which would have ripped and torn the flesh and open wounds, which likely would have come in contact with the bodily fluids. And so what that means is a lot of Africans would experience infection. And that infection has its own horrifying smells and disease. And so these enslaved Africans would have been sick, infected, malnourished, thirsty, hot, terrified. All of this for months at a time. Now, this is where it gets particularly bad, and it's worth noting this might not be appropriate for children. Women and men of all ages, so boys and girls, would have been subject to sexual abuse throughout the voyage by the sailors, and packed together like that in the situations where the ships did not distinguish between men and women. They might have been even sexually abused by fellow captives. Toni Morrison, in the book Beloved, has one chapter, Stream of Consciousness, which is, in a sense, the memory of the crossing. So if any of you have not read Beloved, I highly recommend it. Toni Morrison was amazing. But that chapter is chilling. And so these captive people, men, women, children, would be experiencing all of that horrifying stench and smell and whatnot, but then would be subject to sexual abuse by the sailors as well, which is horrifying. So some women might have been pregnant, etc. So what does that mean? What we also know is that women would attempt to perform self-abortions if they were pregnant, which would have led to significant bodily trauma and death. And again, the flowing of blood to commingle with the rest of the horror. When Africans were brought above decks, eventually these professional ships had high sides where they would bring the Africans up the upper decks because, of course, Africans would attempt to jump overboard. They'd be shackled together, they'd attempt to jump overboard so they could either A, swim home if they could, or end their suffering. And so we know that jumping overboard occurred frequently on these slave voyages. So much so that later designs of slave ships took into account that reality, and they took steps to try to prevent enslaved people from throwing themselves overboard. We know that the dead bodies, when people would die, would just be thrown overboard. And we have accounts from the records, from the logs, that sharks would follow behind some of these slave ships because they knew they could get cheap, easy meals of dead bodies. And I remember one of my students asked, because sometimes people are just absurd in the things they think about, and they said, well, but sharks don't eat people because people aren't very good nutrition. And I said, yes, sharks will not hunt people because we don't have a lot of fat on us. And enslaved Africans being starved and eating just a bowl of rice or wheat or millet or cheap grains to survive are not very good nutrition. But of course, the fact that sharks would follow behind these vessels indicates just how many people would have been thrown overboard, that this was not a rare occurrence. And when you look in the slave trade database, there's a record of how many embarked and how many arrived. And one of the chilling realities when you look at the numbers is that the English slave voyages, they lose about 20% of the people. So if they had a slave ship of 100, I'm just illustrating the numbers, of 100 human beings that they were bringing over to sell into slavery, 20 of them wouldn't survive and would be thrown overboard. And so even as we look at the millions who are brought into slavery in the Americas, that doesn't account for what would have been the millions of human beings who never survived to make it into slavery in the first place. So this is, over the 400 years, this is a Holocaust of African life. It's not a deliberate genocide, in that there was no, the English, Dutch, Spanish, French, Portuguese were not attempting to kill Africans. They didn't want to kill Africans. They just didn't want necessarily to save them. But it is a Holocaust, and millions of Africans die during the slave trade. And so they survive the crossing. They survive all of these horrifying incidents and events and just the sheer terror of it. And I'm sure at some point what you have is an utter trauma. And this is the other reality. Now that we know intergenerational trauma is a thing, just getting to South Carolina, just getting to New York, just getting to Cuba, just getting to San Domingue, Port-au-Prince, just getting to Barranquilla, just getting into slavery is one of the most horrifying traumas that a human being can ever experience in his or her life. All the words that I described can in no way capture the sheer level of continuous horror that these people experienced and survived. When the slave ship arrives in port, it then becomes time to prepare the people to sell them. And every major seaport in the United States, what becomes the United States, had a slave market. In New York, it was on Wall Street. I kid you not. Especially so many Wall Street fortunes started in the slave trade or related to the slave trade. In Philadelphia, it was at the London Coffee House at Front and Market Street. It's a bus terminal now. That was the Philadelphia slave market. In Newport, Rhode Island. In Newport News, Virginia. In Charleston. In Savannah. In Wilmington, North Carolina. In Wilmington, Delaware. These are slave ports. They would bring the enslaved people to the port, and of course, in the last few days before they arrive, they would start to feed them a little more so that they wouldn't be as skinny or look as sickly. There was an account, it's in a documentary, from the descendant of a plantation owner who found records that at one point the city of Charleston made an ordinance. They passed a law that required slave vessels to dock far out of port because these slave trading vessels dumped so many human bodies into Charleston Harbor that the residents of Charleston complained about the stench. They didn't complain about the crime against humanity. They complained that it smelled terrible that so many dead bodies were being dumped into Charleston Harbor. So again, what does that mean? Charleston Harbor, that cute, quaint little harbor, is a graveyard. Or a grave sea. I don't know. I guess it's not a yard. A grave port. Thousands of human beings went to their final rest in Charleston Harbor over the years. And Savannah, probably New York, probably Philly, on the Delaware River, etc. And so these are holy areas if you are a religious person who believes in honoring the dead. So they would get their doubled rations, they'd bring them up. They would then, of course, bathe them, try to wash off the filth of the voyage, give them more water. And this is where it gets particularly gross because, of course, most enslaved people had wounds, right? So you have the shackles. You also have the situation where you can't move, right? We know bed sores are a thing. People who are in the hospital who don't move develop sores, and that's when they're laying in a soft bed, not laying on the rough-hewn planks of a ship deck. And so these human beings would have been covered in sores and wounds from what they endured. And what the sailors would do, the slave traders would do, is they would take tar, which all ships had on board because they would use tar to seal the cracks on the ship, and they would take this tar and they would rub it into the wounds of the enslaved people. And tar is hot. So hot tar would be rubbed into the wounds of traumatized, suffering people to cover up the wounds. And the fact that tar was also dark was also beneficial because it helped kind of masquerade the wounds. And then, in the case of Charleston, the enslaved people would be loaded onto smaller boats once the ordinance was passed and rowed into port to be put on the auction block. Every major city, meaning Philly, New York, probably even Burlington, New Jersey, in the early days when it was a major trade city still, had special slave pens built. So all the slaves would be brought into the slave pens and locked up there until the auction day. Before the auctions, the prospective purchasers could visit the slave pens and examine the cargo. And so enslaved individuals would then be subjected to the humiliation of people poking and prodding and looking in them. Again, women would be, particularly because the English passed the new laws that created hereditary slavery. It's notable that the English and then the Dutch are the ones who will invest the most in trading enslaved African women Not to say the Spanish and Portuguese don't do it, they do, but in the Spanish and Portuguese colonies in the early centuries, most of enslaved captives were men because they wanted minors and whatnot. But the English, they want women, they want young girls. Yeah. Any major port would have had. There's a good chance in Burlington that they would have just sailed down to Philadelphia to purchase enslaved people. It's worth investigating. There's a good chance of it. I don't know for certain, but there was definitely, I mean, slavery existed in Burlington, along the Delaware seaports, Delaware River seaports. But yeah, so the English begin trading in women because since they passed hereditary slavery, it means that every enslaved woman could be the mother to a new generation of enslaved people. And what that means is that, of course, these men, because it was always men, would examine the woman for her fertility. And so what you have is these women who might have been Catholics, might have been Muslim, even if they weren't Catholic and Muslim. People have senses of propriety. And so they might have been violated on the journey by the sailors. But just about every woman, if not violated sexually for the purposes of sexual exploitation, they would have been violated at the marketplace by slave traders looking to see if the woman would be a good potential mother of new babies that could be kept as slaves. And so it is a complete and total humiliation and violence against women for the virtue of their slavery. We also know men could be humiliated. One part of the slave trade that becomes part of the professionalism is that they develop a secondary trade. And so I was using the example of Charleston and Philly and potentially Burlington. But the reality is that by the 1700s, most voyages from Africa would go to the Caribbean. And enslaved people would be put to work on the sugar plantations for a season. And what the English called this was seasoning. And the idea, and this is what I mean about professionalization in the most grimmest and horrifying sense, is they would use the backbreaking labor, the hot sun in Barbados, Cuba, Trinidad. I mean, you pick your island where they're growing sugar to break the will of the Africans, because Africans rebelled. Africans remembered freedom. Africans remembered Africa. Africans wanted to go back to Africa. This is where the inspiration came from, because I was talking about colonization last week. And so these Africans would be seasoned in the Caribbean, have their spirits broken, be worked to the point of exhaustion, be worked to the point where they would do anything to get out of there. And so what would happen most often by the 1700s, late 1700s, the American Revolution, is that cities like Charleston, Philly, etc., Africans who survived the seasoning. You can catch the end of it later, Lynn. Sorry, I was running late. There's too much to cover. Enslaved Africans would be sold on a secondary market. So a ship from Barbados would take 20 or 30 survivors from the Barbados sugar plantations, and they'd be loaded on a ship from Barbados and then sail to Charleston and be sold to Charleston. Because the, quote, saltwater Africans, those who came directly from Africa, would be too rebellious or would be difficult to work. They don't speak the language. They don't understand the system, etc. And so they tried to build more compliance into the system by seasoning Africans. So you have all of this secondary trauma, work to exhaustion, broken, mentally, psychologically broken, and then put on the auction block and then sold. And basically, this is the thing. The living a life of slavery is trauma. But there is not a single human being who was sold into slavery who didn't experience trauma getting there. And so these individuals who survived slavery are incredible survivors. And when we look at taking it specifically to African Americans in America and the influence that African Americans have had on American culture, more broadly speaking, the contributions that African Americans have made to our shared American culture, the reality is these are incredible contributions made by people who survived incredible trauma, and that trauma informed their sensibilities, their faith, their religion, their everything about what freedom is, what it means to live, and how. And this is when I talk about the resiliency. How can a person continue to find moments of humanity and moments of joy? How can they begin to understand and define and advocate for freedom as the survivors of almost unendurable horror and trauma? And when we look at all of the disgusting and horrifying things, it is not just to see the disgust and the horror, though we must face this reality, but it is to look at the ancestors who survived that and to praise and recognize the incredible human beings that they were. To have lived, to have survived, and to have found a way, or as, who said it? I don't remember who specifically said this quote. I could probably Google it quickly. Oh, it's an episode of Many Rivers to Cross, the African-American documentary by Henry Louis Gates Jr., and it was How to Make a Way Out of No Way. African Americans living today and the ancestors of those living today, they made a way out of no way. And like Jay, you just said now that we still have trauma living in America. African Americans today continue to live traumatized lives. But if looking back on the ancestors means anything, it should be a source of strength. It should be a recognition that living a life of trauma today is horrible and unjust and should not be. But ancestors survived it. We can survive it. And not just survive it, but survive it in a way that African Americans built the basis of the American economy. They built our culture. They created America as America is, even as traumatized individuals trying to make a way out of no way. And that is inspiring. That is a source of strength to, as Shakespeare said, screw your courage to the sticking place. This is Macbeth. The sticking place is the survival of the ancestors. The sticking place is, and you said it, Cassandra, thanks for sharing that there were rebellions. The sticking place is that people do not bow to trauma. People survive trauma. People escape trauma, which is also a means of resistance. And people persist through trauma. And the story of Africans in America is a story of resilience, creativity, joy, and humanity in the face of unbelievable horror. But a face of strength, creativity, joy, rebelliousness, rebellion. So I'll leave it there for now. Anybody have any questions? Like I said, I'm going to provide you some links of information. Yes, I agree, Jay. We have to get through this eruption of trauma and hatred that we're living through right now. And we need to make our young people aware as well of the things that their ancestors survived so that they could live today. I think kids, because we don't teach, and this is again going back to Lauren's first inspiration for this entire project, because kids do not learn this history, it's a shock that gets dropped on them when they become young adults. But if we can instill into our children, not just African American children, but in the case of this class, particularly African American children, that they are the descendants of strong survivors. Hi, Andrea. Good to see you. That they are the descendants of people who survived incredible odds and incredible strength, and to just be the best they can to honor that perhaps would be a great source of inspiration. So, any questions? I ran really long today. You know, I kept saying I was trying to cut it short, but man, I just have difficulty doing that apparently. Please ask the questions. Like I said, links will go up as soon as this video goes up. And the slave trade database that I'm going to link to, please go through it. They have a video that animates the slave trade, kind of the voyages themselves. It's worth watching. It's 10 minutes long, and it's extraordinary. And you can find names and voyages and people and statistics and data and just destinations. I mean, there's so much there. And in fact, it's possible, if we can dig far enough, perhaps some African Americans today whose ancestors might have come over more recently, it could be possible to even find one's way back to Africa and who one's people are, which would be an incredible gift, I would think. Alrighty. I'm not seeing any questions. I do love your gratitude. I thank you for tuning in honor. I have a feeling, Jay, that you might be correct, that it is by design. American history is meant to glorify America, not to teach about America. And that's part of the problem. When you glorify stuff, you don't address the issues that need addressing, which are the problems. And yes, it is up to parents to instill in children where we were, from where we have come, and where we should go in the best possible way. All right, I'm going to leave that as my final thought. I will see you all. Look for the links. When you have time, go into the slave trade database. Share it with your friends. There is so much incredible information. There are so many resources there that can help you to understand the struggles, the survival. Alrighty? Have a great day, everyone. And I will talk. Let me see if I can just throw it in right now. And I will see you all next week. Alrighty? Take care. Have a wonderful day.